Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cervena Barva Press Reads Around the World. And I'm Gloria Mindock, editor of Cervena Barva Press. And today we are focusing on Ukrainian writers from the past and present. Our host this afternoon is Michael Naydan. And again, Michael, thank you so much for organizing this and putting it all together. And thank you to those attending and to the readers and translators. And I had the pleasure to publish the book, Two Colors of the Soul, the selected poetry of Dmytro Pavlychenko. And Michael was the editor, wrote the introduction, and was one of the translators. And the reason I mention the book is because it's very special to me. And I would like to say a few other words about Michael. He is translator, co-translator, or editor of over 40 books of translations from Ukrainian and Russian, as well as over 100 articles and translations in literary journals. He is Waskab Family Professor of Ukrainian Studies at Penn State University. And I give you Michael.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction. I first met Gloria through that book by Dmytro Pavlychenko that we did, and that particular poem, Two Colors, which we took the title from, Two Colors of the Soul, really, captured the imagination of an entire country. It became one of the most popular songs ever in the country, called Dva Kольори, and the basic theme of it is Ukrainian embroidery, and it's the two colors of the soul are black for sorrow and red for joy, and they kind of intertwine and change over time in life, and encapsulates all of human experience. So I'm going to share my screen, and it's we decided to do something that I really love, which is poetry, which I've loved since I was, I guess, a senior in high school. And I had two great creative writing teachers in college, Pulitzer Prize winning poet Henry Taylor and Myra Sklarou at the American University. And they really helped engage me in poetry. And I had wonderful professors of poetry who really got my interest, and I became interested in translating Ukrainian poetry and Russian poetry when I was still an undergraduate at American U and then later in grad school at Columbia. And I'm going to share my screen here, and I brought together several of my friends, and a couple of them are kind of hidden secrets of Ukrainian poetry. It's for different reasons. With the case of Oles Ilchenko, he lives back and forth between Switzerland and Kyiv, goes back and forth, and he is part of the literary processes there in Ukraine, but does a lot of traveling, and that actually appears in a lot of his poetry. And Oles is going to be reading his works in Ukrainian, and then I will be Michael will be reading the translations into English. And I'm going to share my screen and just go over a few things here with you, and I'll unshare as soon as possible. But this is the cover of the book that I did of Oles's poetry with Blagoslav Publishers in 2017, called Conversations Before Silence. I learned about Oles's poetry from one of my really great friends in Ukraine, the poet Victor Neborak. And I asked him, Victor, who are you reading? What really interests you? And then he told me, well, you have to read this poetry by Oles Ilchenko. It's wonderful. It's written in free verse. He's one of the first, Ukrainian poets in Ukraine whose all of his writing is in free verse. And it was really just, as they say in Ukrainian, the відкриття for me, a great discovery. And I really loved it. And so I started working on that. And I met him in Kyiv when I was there. He happened to be there. So that's the book we'll be talking about. Mariya Tytarenko is our other poet who's going to be reading today. And I just put on her latest book, which is not a book of poetry, but it's Communication from Scratch, Essays for Manya, which is very poetic look at language and the way children are really creative and how they make adults creative. So she'll read a little excerpt from that along with her poetry. And a few of the others we're going to work on today. My colleague here from Penn State for many years, James Brassfield, who now lives in Maine, won the 2000 Penn Award for Poetry and Translation for this book, The Selected Poems of Oleh Lysheha, that was published by Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute Press. And that's a wonderful book that Oleh was a character. Unfortunately, he died, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago. And he was a Fulbright scholar here at Penn State. And then Jim was also a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine 2 times and really worked very closely with Oleh. And he's a very unique poet. And Jim will talk about that a little bit later. This is an early picture of the two of them at the Fulbright office in Kyiv. And I guess this is circa 1999 when Jim was on his Fulbright in Ukraine at Kyiv Mohylny Academy University. And that's Oleh, the bearded gentleman next to him, who is extremely well read. That's something I noticed about Ukrainian poets. They are extremely well read, international poets, other literatures, their own literature. They really are lovers of literature, and that influences the way they write. And Oleh's metaphysical poetry, bound with nature, is influenced greatly by his knowledge of, American poets and writers like Thoreau and Walt Whitman in particular. This was the farewell party for my Fulbright in Ukraine when I was about to leave. And that's Mariya Rubchak in the middle there. And that's Oleh Lysheha. This is the stoop of the apartment that I stayed at in Lviv. That's Natalka, and I forget her last name. Do you remember? I don't remember her last name, but I remember her first name, Natalka. And that's the now very famous Ukrainian writer, Yuri Andrukhovich, poet and prose writer behind. And that's Lydia Stefanovska, who is a scholar and translator at the University of Warsaw. And that's actually me meeting with Oleh Lysheha. And this is in the courtyard of Mohylny Academy University. This is the cover of the poetry book that we did as a collaborative project. And I'm really grateful to Mariya Rubchak and the poet's widow, who was a real driving force in this. She wrote an absolutely wonderful biographical analysis of the meanings of some of the poems and her life with the poet and his poetry. It's a must read for anybody interested in poetry. And that cover was designed by Glagoslav Publishers designer, Max Mendor, who is a fantastic book designer. He took several pictures of Bodhan at different ages and combined them into this cover. And I worked very closely with Svetlana Bujak-Jones, who has a PhD in linguistics from University of Ottawa. And she lives in our town of State College and works as an interpreter for the State Department and also professional translator. This is a picture of Bohdan Rubchak, very professorial looking. He was a professor at the University of Illinois and part of the New York group of poets, along with Bohdan Boychuk, Tarnowski, and a few others. Patricia Nelwarren, actually, who went by her pen name of Patricia Kilina at that time, and several others, really did a very interesting new look at Ukrainian poetry through the prism of, emigration and other influences. And this is a portrait of Bohdan Rubchak that's in the Ivan Franko Society office in Lviv. I initially didn't like it, but actually it's grown on me. It, I think, is expressive of the character of Bodhan, a little bit, joking, a little bit cantankerous, always provoking, trying to, get you into a little bit of an argument with him over all kinds of different things, and always a, very fascinating guy. And the fact that I knew Mariana so well, we both had Fulbrights in Ukraine at the same time. That really got me interested in working on his poetry, which I had not done before the book, other than a couple of translations. And this is if we have time at the end, we'll just read one poem or two from two Ukrainian poets that I also did books with. I do a lot of books with Pyramida Publishers and Vasyl Gabor, who edits a series there. And this is the poetry that's a bilingual edition. When I do bilingual editions, I publish in Ukraine. And this one is called Tisha Ihrim, Silence and Thunder, by Vasyl Symonenko, who was one of the poets of the 60s, extremely influential for Ukrainian poetry. And a lot of these poets really suffered. According to what I've heard, Symonenko was brutally beaten by 2 KGB agents at a train station platform, and he eventually died of injuries sustained, from that 6 months later. And he's one of the first poets I translated. I've translated 3 poems in modern poetry and translation of Symonenko, and it was accessible to me. He writes in a straightforward style, and but also many of the poems were powerful. He really died too early in his life to, really fulfill his talent, all his talents. And that's the cover of that first collection of his, and only collection that was published in his lifetime, 1962, Silence and Thunder. And that translation that I did, I worked closely with Alla Perminova, who can't join us today because she's on a plane traveling from Ukraine, from Kyiv to Barcelona. So she won't be able to be here today. Those are just a couple of pictures of Symonenko and the youthful vigor of these poets who wrote in Ukrainian, energize an entire people with their poetry. Symonenko also secretly wrote political poetry in his time, and even some of his lyrical poetry you can read as extremely political, because it's two-level. You have to kind of write in an Aesopian way. And this is another book that I did with Glogoslav Publishers, and this Contours of the City, Attyla Mohylny. And it's a poet that probably nobody has heard of in Ukraine and nobody has heard of in the US. He wrote one brilliant book of poetry that's in free verse. And unfortunately, he died of alcoholism at the age of about 47. And he was a real character, a very interesting character, but he wrote in this really free style that really translates easily into English for me. It's like with some poets, poetry comes out when I translate them. With others, I have to work on it because there are, deeper complexities there. And that's a picture I took of Attyla in his apartment in Kyiv in 1993. So I'm going to do that instead of an introduction. So we'll get to the poetry now. And Oles Ilchenko is going to be reading in Ukrainian, and Michael Bernosky. And Oles has about 7 or 8 books of poetry, a bunch of children's books, something like 20 or so, culturological books, and really, really multifaceted person. And he lives in Switzerland now with his wife and does travel back quite a bit to Ukraine. So Oles, if you can read якщо ти можеш читати перший вірш.
Так, thank you very much. Дякую. Отже, я буду читати в тому порядку, з яким у нас є домовленість. Отже.
Прошу дуже.
Так. Тебе ховали, дощило. Люди казали, то спогади падають рясним дощем. Згадував тепло твого тіла, твій голос, як ти вимовляла слова, звернені до мене. Тепер вони також падали просто переді мною. Гадаю, крім тіл, нічого не зникає ні в нас, ані між нами. Плющ міцно притискається до стовбура, лине до неба. Дерево, зрештою, падає і тягне за собою видкі пагони. Маємо трохи зачекати.
Окей, Марко.
They laid you out. It rained that day. People said that recollections fall in an abundant rain. I remembered the warmth of your body, your voice, the way you used to shape the sound of words for me. Now they also fell right before me. I think that nothing fades away other than bodies not inside us, not between us. Ivy clings tightly to a tree trunk and soars to the sky. The tree eventually falls and pulls the winding branches down behind it. It remains for us only to wait, just a little bit more.
Okay, слідуючий. Next one.
Поволі, коли тіло глибше в себе, а дух спрямовує лед вище і вище, погляд змінюється, оковид його здіймається і росте. Очі душі споглядають усе згори, на відміну від дитячих літ, коли зір поціляє від землі до хмар, а згодом летить як рівний до рівного. Хочеться не прогавити, запам'ятати з милосердя пору чи секунду абсолютної вивищеності нового «я».
Passage. Slowly, as the body goes deeper into itself, and the spirit directs its flight higher and higher, and gaze changes, the field of vision rises up and grows. The eyes of the soul always keep watch from above, in contrast to childhood, when your sight is directed from the earth to the clouds, and in time flies like an equal to an equal. You want not to miss out of mercy, a movement or a second of the absolute elevated nature of your new I.
One thing I forgot to is introduce Michael. This is my actor friend, Michael Bernowski, who lives in the neighboring town of Bollesburg. And we've done many readings together, both
Fulbright, too.
Fulbright and performances together throughout the United States. And just wanted to share his deep, booming reading voice with you. Oles, слідуючий.
Варто дочекатися по-справжньому теплого літнього вечора, вийти послухати цвіркунів, знайти клаптик свіжої конюшини серед пиріїв і кульбаб, занурити обличчя в трійчасте листя, відчути солодко-кисловатий дух, смак, колір. Це справжня мить, така непідробна глибинна, на відміну від так званого життя. Воно метушиться, мов крапля ртуті в сірниковій коробці, ходить квадратовим колом, а конюшинове листя вічне, бо свіже, а вечори теплі, бо наші. В такий час я тебе бажаю, жадаю, хочу відчувати істинність нас двох таких.
It's worth it to wait for a truly warm summer evening, to step out, to listen to the crickets, to find a handful of fresh clover among the wheatgrass and dandelions, to bury your face in a trefoiled leaf, to sense its bittersweet fragrance, taste, color. This is a true moment, such an authentic, deep one, the opposite of so-called life that rushes like a drop of quicksilver in a matchbox, moving all around in its square circle. The clover leaf is eternal because it's fresh, and the evenings warm because they are ours. It is in just such a time I desire, crave, want you, sensing the truth of the two of us.
Hey, слідуючий.
Каїр. Безлад безглуздих, безупинних, безцільних потоків авт, без регулювальників, без розмітки доріг, без підморгувань світлофорів, каруселя спекотного дня, гойдалка непевної прохолоди ночі і рожева свіжість чаю з гібіскуса. Можна торгуватися, можна домогтися знижки, можна придбати і забути, можна перетнути Ніл, поглянути на купи сміття на мальовничих берегах, на коня, що неквапом пливе черевом догори, вигрівається на сонці, прямує за течією, а потім слід бачити гори на обрії, які прикидаються миражем за пальмами, сірі трикутники на знебарвленому небі, згадати слово «гіза», знову зауважити дзищання знаків дня, що зводяться врешті до пірамідної оречевленості вічності.
Cairo, the chaos of senseless, ceaseless, aimless stream of cars, no traffic cops, no road signs, no blinking traffic lights, the carousel of a scorching day, the swing of an uncertain chilling of the night, and the pink freshness of hibiscus tea. You can haggle, you can work out a discount, you can get something and forget, you can cross the Nile, you can look at piles of trash on its picturesque banks, and a horse that sluggishly floats, belly up, warms itself in the sun, follows the flow, and then you should see the mountains on the horizon that pretend to be a mirage beyond the palm trees, gray triangles on a colorless sky, to remember the word Giza, again to notice the buzz of the signs of the day, that in the end are reduced to the pyramidic thingification of eternity.
That, by the way, is one of my favorites of Olesh's poetry. Very creative in terms of the language of the original. And the next one, Green Boat. I think that's the next one.
Везучи тіла крізь краєвиди, постійно залишаємося у так званому минулому, уперто привласнюючи його, фальшуючи документи і свідоцтва, наполегливо пишемо апокрифічні тексти, вигадані історії, замість навчитися вловлювати і розрізняти знаки і натяки. Тренуємо пам'ять, примушуємо її творити світ, якого не було, а варто було б зацікавитися світами, кольорозвуками і вічними хмарохрамами там і в собі.
A green boat, hauling bodies through landscapes, we constantly remain in this so-called past, stubbornly appropriating it, falsifying documents and certificates. We persistently write apocryphal texts and imaginary stories. Instead of learning to capture and differentiate signs and hints, we train our memory, forcing it to create a world that did not exist, but it would be worthwhile to get interested in worlds, color sounds, and the eternal cloud cathedrals there, as well as inside yourself.
Okay, the next one is to find the exit from the labyrinth.
Знайти вихід з лабіринту, мотати ниточку, спокусивши Аріадну. Слід також вбити чи оминути Мінотавра або ж дракона, тут і десь. Щаслива мить виходу назовні, захват від небаченого простору, який тим часом може виявитися жахом нескінченної темряви і стати безмежною ніччю, чи просто тихою ніченькою, якою-небудь Крісталнахт.
To find the exit from the labyrinth. To find the exit from the labyrinth, to wind the thread having seduced Ariadne, one should also kill or avoid the Minotaur or the dragon here and hereabouts. The happy moment of egress outward, the rapture from unknown space that at the same time may turn out to be the horror of infinite darkness, to become the boundless night, or simply a quiet night, a kind of Kristallnacht.
Okay, the next one, but then to separate.
А потім відділити свідомість. Вона знайде вихід крізь грати, відімкне замки, піде невидними потаємними ходами. Вона зуміє пронести скарб, який виріс із болю і втрат, став твоєю фамільною коштовністю. Свідомості не слід зупинятися і забувати закляття проти часу людожера.
But then to separate consciousness. It will find a way out, through the gratings, will unlock the locks, will pass through unseen secret passages. It will be able to carry past the treasure that grew out of pain and losses that became our family treasure. Consciousness shouldn't stop and forget incantations against time, that cannibal.
Okay, and this is the last one that Oles will be reading.
Кохаючись із тобою, стаю іншою людиною, за віком, статтю, темпераментом і пам'яттю. Це триває миттєвості, години, але алхімічна вселюбовна трансмутація відбувається щоразу і доводить істинність пережитого з тобою і в собі. Подзвін серця і крови звучить у скронях. Пізнаю тебе зовні зсередини, завжди хвилююсь, бо щодня ти інакша, нова, незбагненна. Починаю згадувати тебе й жадати просто після прощання.
When I make love with you, I become a different person in age, in gender, in temperament, in memory. This moment lasts hours, but the alchemic, all-loving transmutation happens each time and proves the reality of everything experienced with you and in myself. The tolling of the heart and blood resonates in my temples. I perceive you from without and within. I always worry because every day you are different and new and unfathomable. I begin to remember you and yearn for you again, right at the moment, right after we part.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Oles.
Дякую. Thank you very much.
And so Oles is from a Kyiv poet, and there are differences between Kievan poets and poets from different parts of Ukraine and emigre poets, but we won't get into that here today. But in order to move a little bit further west to the city of Lviv, we have Mariya Tytarenko, who'll be reading her poetry for us. And I've known Mariya for quite a long time. She was a Fulbright scholar here at Penn State, traveled many times to Lviv and interacted there. Her sister was a master's student. I do a lot of translation with her sister. We've done, I think, 5 books together that we co-translated from Russian and Ukrainian. And Mariya is a kind of a jack of all trades, or I guess a Jill of all trades. But She is a professor of journalism at Catholic University, and she also teaches one of the first creative writing classes in Ukraine. She just came back from a writer's workshop that she was participating in and leading in Carpathian Mountains. And I've found her poetry very interesting. She won the prize as one of the top poets in Ukraine under the age of 30, the Bohdan Prize. When she was under 30, we won't reveal her age now, but she looks a lot younger than even she thinks she is. So every chance I get to translate her poetry, I do translate it. There is a wonderful poem of hers called Moste, Bridges, that's there's on YouTube. If you go to YouTube, if you got the announcement for the poetry reading today, there was an animation that was done for that for Traffica Europe magazine, and the animation with Mariya reading her own my translation of the poem in her own voice is available there, and I highly recommend reading that. She'll be reading a few of her poems here. She'll read one or two, both in Ukrainian and English, and the others, another two or three of them, just in English. And she'll maybe read a page from her book on her essays to her daughter Manya. Okay, Mariya, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Michael, for such a wonderful introduction. That's my honor and pleasure to join such wonderful reading here. And I will start with my latest, I think, poem, dedicated to 9/11. That was that we actually commemorated yesterday. So in particular, it's dedicated to Helen Crossin Kittel and her unborn daughter, Patricia Helen Crossin Kittel, died during 9/11. Patricia's not afraid. Sing me a lullaby, Mom. Clutch me with your large hot palms, just like today in the elevator when we ascended to your 103rd floor into your working sky. Patricia's not afraid. I hear the language of your heart, Mom. It tells me the stories of our ancestors. You have a big heart. The memory of our kin has no end, except here on our branch with you, where the seed bud is. Patricia's not afraid. For 5 months, I've been learned your every move and the half tone of your voice, the ringtones of your cell phone, your favorite dresses that you set aside for later, along with a wedding ring that's become too tight. You are the most beautiful mother in the world. I'm a lot like you, you'll see. You'll see earlier than February 15, circled on your calendar. Patricia's not afraid. When your heart pauses the world, I'll hold your hand like this. I'll sing the end of your lullaby. I already know the last line. Patricia's with her mother is not afraid. The next poem, actually, it was written, I think, when I was in the United States in 2008, during my Fulbright stay. It was written to my boyfriend, now a husband, and it's entitled A 7-Hour Time Difference. And it was indeed a 7-hour time difference between me in State College, Pennsylvania, and Lviv in Ukraine. I will read it first in Ukrainian. Різниця в 7 годин. Твоя відримована ніч мені утіка під повіки, і п'яні дерева в цвіту танцюють гротескного пак, і я роздягаюсь у сон. І ти убираєшся в ранок, і знов розминулися ми, ідучи на той самий смуляк. А мій неримований день висує душу і брук, по коліна в снігах поволі вилизує сіль, і ти пригортаєш мене, і я огортаюсь у тишу. І так зустрічаємось ми на різних планетах Землі. Our time difference. Your perfectly rhymed night is escaping from my eyelid. Drunken trees bloom, grotesquely dancing hopak. I'm undressing for sleep, and you are getting dressed for the morning. We move toward the same lighthouse beacon, missing each other once again. And my unrhymed day is rocking your soul to sleep, and the cobblestone pavement is knee-deep in snow, slowly licking up salt, and you nestle close to me. I cloak myself in silence, and so we rendezvous on different planets of Earth. The next poem, I will also read it in Ukrainian first. Живемо так, наче нікого нема через стіну, і наша брудна вода тече, щоб до нас не вертати. І серце твоє ще битиметься, як б'ється в мені дитина, аби жити і жити, а не поволі вмирати. А помремо ми так, наче ніколи дерев не садили, не навчали дітей читати по складах, мапах і ранах, наче ми не росли, а потім назад не маліли, і наче ніколи не були самими нами. А знаєш, нехай. Ми такі проминальні куці, недалекі, життя сортуємо у гаманці, альбоми, домовини. Ой, дивись, дивись, он де летить той самий лелека, який нам торік із тобою приніс дитину. We are living as if no one's on the other side of the wall, and our dirty water flows so as not to return to us. And your heart will still be beating the way a baby is beating inside me, to live and keep living and not to die slowly. And we'll die as if we never had planted trees, never taught children to read by syllables, maps and cards, as if we never had grown up and then had grown small again, as if we never had been our very selves. Know what? Let us be so ephemeral, limited, and dense, sorting our lives in wallets, albums, and coffins. Oh, look, look, there, that same stork is flying that brought us a baby a year ago. The next poem from my collection that won Bohdan Antonich Prize. Воронами літер сидять непорушно вірші. Сніг тчеться в міжряддя і пада в колодязь крапок. Тин речення вбік похилився, за ним ні душі, лиш тиша лопата між лапок, ворон і лапок. Тут вже на снігу так багато пташиних слідів, і в небі курсивом польотів незримий санскрит, і сходами строф, так, неначе йдучи по воді, спускається той, хто дарує воронам політ. In crowds of letters, poems sit motionless. Snow flows into the rose and falls into the well of periods. The fence of a sentence leaned, behind it not a soul, just heavy silence between the feet of rows and quotation marks. Already here on the snow are so many tracks of birds, and in the sky in the italics of their flight invisible Sanskrit, and along the stairs of stanzas, as though walking on water, the one who gives flight to the crows comes down. Now I want to read a very brief abstract from my book, Communication from Zero, or Essays for My Manya. And actually that is a fragment from the very essay, the very first essay of this book that won the first international prize in the essay contest by Fountain magazine in 2015. And I've chosen that abstract because I think it corresponds to our now COVID realia, though it was written, I think, 7 years ago. To go or not to go? I wonder, what kind of generation Manias will be? Manya, that's the name of my older daughter. So I wonder what kind of generation Manias will be. Presumably, it will be a time of anchor tax, since it will be possible to live your entire life without leaving your room cell. You will get your education via the net, work at home, turn your home into an office, a museum, a library, a cinema, a restaurant. There will be no need to go out, never be late, never lose your keys, never forget your umbrella while it's raining, never be crunched by a crowd in the metro at rush hour, never be stuck in a traffic jam, never be stuck in the elevator, never be robbed on the street, never wait for a taxi, never iron or an office suit, never break your high heels, never be a passive smoker, never be a person on the go. So, would one remain human at all? What would happen to bees if they'd stop flying out of their cells to collect honey? The worst thing, I suppose. Their wings would atrophy. I don't want my Manya to lose her wings. Wings are what make us human beings. I don't want her to become a prisoner of her cell. I want her to forget her umbrella while it's raining, to lose her keys, to be late, to take coffee to go, to break her high heels. I also want her to ride a horse, to fly on a hot air balloon, to hold her beloved's hand while watching the night sky. She'll argue with him over which constellation corresponds most to its particular strange name. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. And I apologize for my self Zoom bombing of my cell phone. It was somebody one of our friends wanted to get on and called me to ask about it, so she could meet us here. But our next poet who we'll be reading is James Brassfield, whom I've known for a long time here at Penn State, and I even remember the exact moment when he became interested in Ukrainian poetry at Penn State. He shared an office with Oksana Zabushko, who at the time was not particularly famous as she is now, and she's become Ukraine's most famous woman writer writing today. And through those conversations with Oksana, Jim got very interested in Ukrainian poetry, and since Oksana had come to Penn State on a Fulbright, he looked into that program and then got a Fulbright to go to Ukraine. But he ended up, he found a kindred spirit in the poetry of Oleh Lysheha, and who did know English very well. And the two of them hit it off, and there are wonderful stories that Jim could tell for hours, but we won't ask him to do that today. But he also is a poet himself, taught creative writing here at Penn State for many years till his retirement a couple years ago, and now lives in Maine. His third book of poetry is coming out very soon. And I will pass this along to Jim to read and say a few words about Oleh.
Well, thanks, Michael, and hello to all. I'm not going to read any complete poems today by Oleh. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how his poems come to be as poetry, because I think a lot of people have a difficult time reading Lysheha. How do these poems work? And so that's what I'm up to today. I think his poems are not of the past, of course, but are quite relevant now to Ukraine and to our moment universally now. In college, he focused on American literature, especially American modernism. And perhaps the groundbreaking technique of modernism is collage. Both in writing and painting, and of course Picasso creates collage, which is the use of juxtaposition. And so for Lysheha, conventional narrative drops away. And in its place is a patterning of juxtaposed anecdotes or episodes, creating a new form of narrative. Important influences for Lysheha were the free verse poets Robinson Jeffers, Ezra Pound, D.H. Lawrence, who spent much time in America, and Lysheha's late appreciation of Gary Snyder. Rilke's free verse of the elegies, and the vision of Robert Frost, whose rhyme poems were a transparency for Lysheha, who said himself he simply couldn't rhyme his own poems. Many of his long poems were first drafted aloud on a tape recorder and later transcribed. Thus, the leaps of imagination, what came to mind, and were later formed into the patterns of his poems. As a boy in the Soviet Union, his mother enrolled him in art school, which of course was a lifelong influence on his making of poems, as well as his painting and his making of ceramic and wood sculptures. His father taught German language and literature and was an alcoholic. His home life was difficult for him as well as Soviet society. At the age of 23, he was expelled from college for his publishing work that echoed his Western orientation. He was sent into the infantry as a laborer at a missile site outside Moscow, then to Buryatia. He returned home to work in a fur factory in his hometown of Tismanitsia. Then he left for Kyiv and never returned home to live. He returned only to plant the garden field behind his house for his sister and his surviving father, and return again to harvest it. The American frontier, made intimate to him through Thoreau, was ingrained in his vision of the Ukrainian landscape. Civilization, as he knew it, betrayed him, as it continues its forms of betrayals now. What is reality? What we see is a conception of what we see. How are conceptions formed? Lysheha's imagination and his closeness to the natural world, apart from media and popular culture, offer a helpful perspective to our perceptions. His poetry addresses the schism of an awakened individual and one's relation to civilization. What is home? What does Milosz mean when he says, we are all exiles? So I've taken these questions and made a collage myself of excerpts through Oleh's work to try and show us, perhaps in a strange sort of collage from his work, this theme through his work and how juxtaposition operates. Also, I think by shortening these to very short excerpts of poems throughout the selected poems, we can see how tight a book of poems it is, that he's working his way through the themes and images all the way through the book. From Dog. Lying like a boulder in the woods, he lifts his head. His skull a cobweb of veins, his eyes begging as from a baby's bath. Don't come near, let be. Lifting himself to his front legs, eyes yellowed by the recent frost, he discovers again the hair on the horizon. Young nettle, be kind to him. Listen, his heart can't endure any more the arc of your leaves. Now, what we have here is a foreshadowing of the final shadow of the close of the poem of Swan, where the swan lifts its neck and head, which is a transformation of the metaphor of the shadows of pines and mountains, which comes at the end of the selected. From Horse. Someday I will escape. I hope the woods remember me as well. In fact, I'm pulling hard, trying to drag the forest, thick still from what I am, if not the prodigal son of the forest. Sometimes one soul departs too far from home, until a cloud overtakes the sun. Only then will I stir and move forward, prompting calmly the sure way home for the soul. Can one who is lost think otherwise? Each night the festering wound ached, nourishing, provoking the escape. But now, how will it be to leave him alone? Now the him in the poem is a hunter-painter who painted a herd, and that's an important word here, the herd, a herd of horses on a cave wall, and threatened any horse with violence who would leave the herd. From Dolls. And that smell of a stranger's wasted life seemed mine, but it wasn't. I believe now that someone unseen wants always to be by my side. The next day I went away. I woke alone on the train and sat up on the bench, embracing my knees. It was night, and I wondered where my father wandered now, drunk again. Why does he drink so much? As if I didn't know. Well, I won't be back anymore. From Hawk. Where will this road lead me? Such a long road. I'd just like to sit a while. Where will this road plowed with tusks take me? Home? Where is home? Perhaps the hawk knows. Transparent wings spread wide, the dark sunspot in the middle, like a butterfly hovering over a hill in summer. Again, this foreshadows the ending of Swan. From Fox. Seems as if in Kyiv, on the opposite side of the woods, someone never stops conjuring spells. I come back lifeless from the city. In the streets I often meet the dead. I offer my hand. Dead eyes smile back. The dead, pushing themselves, making a place for me in a subway car. But farther on, the genuine woods, ancient and generous. I closed my eyes and silently, as if step by step departed. The bird would not follow me. Perhaps it was fearful of the shade. The bird of the poem is a peacock. And what we have here is with eyes closed, step by step, is an entering into the imagination. And given this landscape, I think we've already sensed so far, is that Lysheha's poetry is one of transcendence, even in the midst of such a civilization. From Carp. And this is an interesting poem, of course, because it's about, the title is of a fish, but it's about his dog Rex. But it is an allusion to his song 551. I saw hidden in the dark sky of a gathering storm, as if my eye were caught by a clear light, a golden cloud passing quickly, but this cloud alone above them, all was quieting. And I thought to myself, you're just as I was once, whole, self-sufficient. I wanted only to possess myself. From Swan. This road won't guide me anymore. The one happy tree, no one knows where it grows or what it looks like, and who is allowed to recognize it. I never stood under it. Now of happiness, the next passage evokes Lysheha's mother. He loved her very much. It's a beautiful moment of his conjuring of his mother, but completely transformed into art. And once among the pines, a woman ran, looking around nervously. Plump legs were still hers, and hugging her neck and hanging over her shoulders, hiding them loosely, was an armful of irises lulled on her breasts. Dusted with pollen, eyelids of the flowers blinked heavily, nodding off. She was floating, a huge cloud, and sinking into that fervent dream, I rocked gently on those breasts. She ran carefully, as if carrying something intimate, a last treasure. She plunged into shadow, harboring the small, weak lungs from the deep incisions of this raw world. And it seemed at that instant, when she came out, she ran from my heart, disappearing suddenly, with the whole world waiting on this deserted road. This road is calling me farther and farther. Oh, excuse me, and this from Swan, I'm sorry. This road is calling me farther and farther. Look at me. I'm spreading my arms and rising to you. My God, I'm falling. So again, rising in terms of transcendence to the spread wings of the swan, to the lifted head and neck, spreading his arms, and yet falling, returning to reality, to the world at large. And finally, these lines from Dolls. But I returned, finding the snow still here, and my cat, the only creature around, skinny and happy, with a tail spry as parsley. And how are you, I asked? Got through the winter? How are our mice? And entering the hut, I found the place a mess. Well, I thought to myself, I'll have another try and scour all I can. We've only a few things, yet what we have will glisten. I am alive, and that's enough.
Yes, thank you very much, Jim. And we're going to have a reading of a few more poems by one other poet. And there are certain poets, we obviously honor in life, and also after they pass away, they really need to be read again by generations and generations. And Oleh is definitely one of those. And Bohdan Rubchak's poetry in the Immigration is another one of those, very powerful poetry, not known as well in English, just because there weren't many translations of his works. He was very well known in the Immigration. He published 6 books of poetry in his lifetime. He was a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And his wife, Mariana Rubchak, who is a professor retired from University of Valparaiso, a professor of history, has done tremendous amounts to make sure that we remember Bohdan's life and poetry. And I would ask her to speak first, and she told me that she would like to talk about why Bohdan stopped writing poetry.
Okay, am I up now?
Yes.
Now, what I'm offering today is just a detail, because something of this significance requires a huge explanation, huge background, which of course we don't have time for, and this is not the place for it. So I will ask you just to bear with me and listen to these few words. This is a very short presentation as to why he stopped writing. As Bodhan watched his impact on Ukrainian literature erode in the 1980s, he gave up hope of becoming an integral part of Ukraine's literary evolution that caused him considerable anguish. His former readership of the aspirants was beginning to demonstrate a preference for works coming out of the literary changes from Ukraine. Younger poets introducing new trends in Ukrainian literature. Then, as early as 1990, the new decade brought new hope for a reconnection. Bodhan dared to dream once more of becoming part of Ukraine's literary process. A dream supported by his 2 visits to the homeland at the beginning of that decade, with its signs of making the Osborne writing a part of Ukraine's literary canon. There, he witnessed a resurgence of his writing as it showed clear signs of joining Ukraine's evolution into a major literary force. Then on a bright sunny day in mid-June 1995, Bodhan received a phone call informing him of a family tragedy. And that is what requires explanation, which I'm not going to go into. The heartbreak was so profound that he could never bring himself to talk or write about it. But Bodhan was much too sensitive to leave the news of such a disaster unacknowledged. He chose to cope with it in his own unique way. Bodhan killed off the best part of himself, his heart, which is what he called his writing. He stilled forever that unique poetic voice that had characterized his poetry. Bodhan never again wrote another line of poetry. Instead, when his poetic heart stopped beating, he moved on to concentrate on his essays. Brilliant works in their own right, but no match for that poetic voice that was establishing his immortality in Ukraine's literary canon. Bodhan was very much in demand as an essayist. He was recruited to write chapters, introductions for books, brilliant pieces in the judgments of his literary critics, but to repeat, no compensation for that uniquely beautiful poetic voice that he had silenced forever. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, I would emphasize that what was irretrievably lost in such an operation was that which his poetry revealed about him. Poetry is the voice of the speaker. By contrast, essayists are made, they're not born. Bodhan invariably wrote about others by design, so we lost an important connection on that level as well. Unlike his poetry, that revealed so much about him, the poet and the person is nowhere to be found in his essays. Bodhan chose to make his voice about others, never about himself. I'm not going to go into details because it would take me too far afield. This was his, I think, tragic moment in his lifetime. And certainly, I think, a great loss to Ukrainian literature, which would have flourished under his unique poetic voice, which was no more. He never returned to it. That is all I can say about this without going into a very detailed explanation of what brought this about, which you probably wouldn't be too interested in anyway, and we don't have time for today. That's it.
Thank you, Mariana, for that. And you can read about the poetry and certain connections between biography and poetry in Mariana's essay in the book that we put out with Glagoslav Publishers. I do think it's a must read. I know Asgard Melnichuk said that it's a must read, and if Asgard says that it's a must read, I feel that it definitely should be. He's such a really, a person with literary acumen. And he said that Mariana's essay in there is one of the most open and candid that he's ever read about, a writer who's passed away by their spouse. And she shares a lot of intimate detail, and she is writing her memoirs now. So hopefully you keep going with that. You said you have 100 pages. So they're
almost done, and they reveal much more than my essay reveals. They're very detailed, some shocking, but they're not intended for publication. That was not the intention. The intention was to respond to his own diaries and our relationship as they are treated in the diaries. So the archivist at Columbia suggested that I write my memoirs to include with his diaries so that we get a balanced account. Because with Bodhan, he was very secretive, as we know. Bodhan would never have given a balanced account. He would give an account from his own perspective, his own unique poetic perspective, which was exaggerated, changed somewhat. It's the way he viewed the world. And when the archivist looked at the diaries, she said, this needs a corrective. And that's what the memoirs are about. So for the present, they are destined only for the archive, about 200 pages. There's so much more I could write. But frankly, I've lived with this for almost 3 years, and I am getting tired. So you can, if you want to know why Bodhan's poetic voice was stilled, it's all there in my memoirs, but you have to go to the archives to find out if there's any curiosity about them. So,
Okay, thank you, Mariana. And now we'll give you a little bit of a taste of the poetry of Bohdan Rubchak, and my co-translator of the volume, Svetlana Bujak-Jones, will be reading maybe one or two in Ukrainian, but explain to you a little bit about his poetic technique that we learned about from doing the translations.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. I am very humbled and very honored to participate along with such distinguished poets and their family members. So this is a very special day for me. I want to thank Professor Naydan for involving me into translating Bohdan Rubchak's poetry. Unfortunately, I was never able to meet Bohdan when he was in State College, but I met him through his poetry. And that was quite an adventure, this translation. That was my very first literary translation, especially the translation of poetry, together with Michael. Michael was a very good teacher in that on that path. So I thank you, Michael, for doing that. And I am going to start with my most favorite poem that Bohdan wrote. It comes from the collection Mareno Topeter, Drowning Mariana, which was published in 1980. And it comes as one of two parts of something called esquisse, which is sketches. Why I like this poem so much is what he done with this poem is something very unique and something is very unexpected. It took us by surprise to figure out what the true meaning of the poem was when we were trying to translate something that we didn't really understand at the beginning. By decomposition of the language itself, he creates a double meaning, which I think is extremely unique. And so in order for you to understand that, I would like to read the Ukrainian version first, and then whatever we came up with in English. Obviously, we were not able to really replicate exactly what the author meant, but we tried to preserve as many features as possible and to make it as playful as it was intended. So this is the first part, my most favorite one, and it's called Madrigal. Крихітно пола, мана моя дама, тремтить дробина очей в очах, мана уст на мені дрижить. Дотиків сніг засипав на сни, на близнята задум коханого тіла, що мозку вощинив його меду. В призмі зору її промінь розбитий, в розчині ночі, блідо освітлений планетокрій. Чоло – монастир, стегна – турецький рай. Волосся – дощ, долоні – сказано сніг, губи – усміх, а очі чомусь у плач. Так дивно пола мана моя дама. So that was the Ukrainian version. And now into English. Madrigal. Tinsely broken, it's my lady. The beads of her eyes quiver in mine. The allure of lips on me, trembling. A snow of touches drifted onto dreams, thinking about the twins of my lover's body, so that every cell of my brain is bathed in its honey. In the prism of vision, her shine is shattered in a melange of night, a dimly lit swarm of tiny planets. Her brow, a monastery, her thighs, a Turkish paradise, her hair, the rain, her palms, the snow, her lips turn into a smile, but her eyes somehow are in tears. So strangely broad, Ken is my lady. All right, so that was one. The second one that I would like to read is something where he, and I'm not going to read any more Ukrainian versions, just the English versions of his poems. This one is called In a Room of 100 Mirrors. It comes from, I believe, his first collection called The Stone Garden, which was published in 1956. And the poem was written in the fall of 1955. There is a lot of soul searching in this poem. In a mirror of 100 mirrors, I, self-loving, see myself beautifully distorted. And only in the great garden of stone walls on their surface, my reflection can never betray me. I often wear grand clothes. They glitter on me rich in colors on the miniature stage of my intimate theater. But in bare, white light, between the bushes of a stone garden, my clothing turns entirely gray. My fairy tale mask grows pale. The makeup of the grotesque runs, and I become myself again. So the next one that I would like to read is something that is very peculiar. It's the one that he wrote when he wasn't even 30 years old. He was about 27, 28. It comes in the collection To the Girl Without a Country. And the poem is called Destination. Why I wanted to read it, it's about the young man who talks about dying and the death and what to expect. So let's see what he has to say. Defiance is fruitless here. The world won't tell you, come back. Away from tomorrow and yesterday, the boat will be driven high up. Farewells will burn, sun, the circle of infinity. The banner of your endurance will be your only friend. There will be no hugs of home, nowhere to come to. You'll feel deadly exhaustion, but you won't make landing. Okay, and then the next one that I would like to read, I want to say that Bohdan always humanized nature. Not just trees, plants, but everything, the earth, the clouds, the sky, the thunder, the lightning, everything had characters, had feelings, and everything behaved in a human-like way. And he was part of that world. In addition to that, he also, his poetry was permeated with the word myths. He constantly was using it, myth in Ukrainian. So it was mentioned in very many poems. And it seems like he liked to live in this some sort of world in his mind that was mystical, that had some sort of story to it. And so I want to read one of his poems that I think tells a little myth. So it tells a little fairy tale story. It's called The Blacksmith. It actually came as one of his latest poems. It was published in the Wayne of Icarus, Krylo Ikarove, which came out in 1991 in Ukraine under New Verses. So, Koval, the blacksmith. Heavenly blacksmiths forge songs that render the blue body of the world. On the muscle of the heart, iron canes chisel a mark of lightning for us. The blacksmith was forging in a grimy village of some dismal district. On the badge of a gazda are word tellers of a myth of a bright, burning, raging earth. He pulls out golden embryos from the hearth. In stern self-oblivion, he teaches them to sing in protoforms. And something small snuggles in the corner. It's so red-haired, big-eyed, and shaggy. It's learning how to forge its own songs. And of course, I wanted to read a whole more, but the last one, I would like to read something very different that he wrote in a haiku style, and it's called Observations. It comes as a part of something called the Notes from a Diary. I like several parts of it a lot, but the last one is very different by style, so I thought I might read that one as well. So, several observations. By the way, these observations are very unique, and I thought that might be worth kind of following his mind in these verses. So, several observations. Black poplars weave the evening expanse on the looms of branches. The body of a beauty and the lustful fingers. The moon and the river. In cast nets of a downpour, something silvery flutters. A lanternfish. A slender brush paints worlds on glass. A poplar and the horizon. Spring birds will awaken groves of pupils. First love. August fingers play on molded violins. That's how pears ripen. The white bird of silence is in the cage of a song. It is a gift for a lover. Green thoughts killed by the frost of words. The old age of a poet. And that's it.
Okay, and I'll read one or two more of Bohdan's poems in our translation, and maybe one poem by Vasyl Symonenko to finish up. That's very short. And this one is called A Song for Mariana. I think you'll know who that is dedicated to. This love is like precious fruit, mature late in season. It's like night that quivers in its final autumn song. I carried this love out of September for its delicate bird-like nature, and for eyes that in a blue whisper beseech beginning, for hair that pours onto breasts like torrents of nets, for palms that in lunar reaches cast the light of saintliness. I live in this love as though in an old misty garden, and gather silver beads of joy in a shady leaf. I became lost in my love's face, as if I were in a bewildering land. In its mysterious landscape, I am seeking myself. And this last one of Bohdan's that I'll read is called A Mandarin for My Wife. When, having outshined myself like a god, saturated with perpetuity, covered in a stone smile, I will step onto the edge, the first and last. When in the morning millions of stairs will wrap the solitary me into a shroud, and in a golden arc will harden all my yearnings and indecisions. Curb your crying, and under sweet cherry leaves, start off alone that roadside day. A baby beggar, smeared all over, is playing there in the mud. His gaze is open and empty, and a breeze has begun to waft in a soft circular flow onto his hair. And I'll just read one more very brief poem by Vasyl Symonenko to wrap up. And again, he's the poet I first translated. My first translations that were published were by Vasyl Symonenko, Lina Kostenko, two Ukrainian poets, Anna Akhmatova, and Osip Mandelstam, two Russian poets. And I published those first in Modern Poetry and Translation in the journal Hyperion. And this is a Symonenko poem. As I mentioned early on, he was tragically beaten by the KGB and died very early because of those injuries he received. I hear, earth, your breathing. I understand your quiet grief. As cold dawns shed the dew in handfuls upon you, I know the downpours and violent storms, and dew and the rustle of boughs. These are orphans' and widows' tears, the sweat of our tortured ancestors. You have collected them beyond measure on the expanse of fields and forests of oak, in order that human tears and human love might nourish you for eternity. I'd like to thank our audience. I'd like to thank all our poets and translators and readers. And if you do have questions, we would be happy to hear them. If not, we can declare the reading a great success and with a wonderful audience. And we really all appreciate this opportunity to share Ukrainian poetry with you, both our visitors from Ukraine and Europe and here in the US. And thank you, Gloria, for suggesting this forum.
Oh, and thank you so much, Michael, for putting this together. I am so grateful. And what a wonderful afternoon of such great work. Oh my gosh. So thank you. You all are so inspiring. So thank you so much.